But now, just a week without the Duke coming, she felt like 1,000 years had passed. The Duke put down his teacup. He told Lucia to continue. Lucia stroked the place where the Duke used to sleep. She didn't know what she would do if a week turned into a month or a year. Although it was a marriage with a purpose, all those sweet little details from before were now too agonizing. Lucia looked at the door that wouldn't open, thinking she had prepared herself for a lifetime of loneliness. But the Duke had been so gentle and considerate to her, and now he suddenly wanted to cut ties. She recalled the Duke's loving gaze when he looked at her, remembering all their beautiful moments together. Lucia angrily thought it was all that man's fault. But the next second, she suddenly burst into tears, blaming herself for being greedy. She had given up on having children from the beginning and married him to change her future. Not long ago, everything was still fine. Lucia couldn't control her sobs. She knew she had messed things up. On the other side, the Duke looked at the pouring rain outside the window, feeling very irritated. Since their argument, Lucia had been strolling in the courtyard every day, and the Duke would time it perfectly to secretly watch her from the window. But on rainy days like this, he couldn't see Lucia. Thinking of this, the Duke irritably ran his fingers through his hair. He wanted to go see Lucia right now. But then he remembered Lucia's expression on the day they argued, so he had to restrain his impulse, although he had been avoiding Lucia these past few days. But in fact, it hadn't even been 2 days before he started secretly glancing at Lucia when she was in the courtyard. The Duke clenched his fists, feeling he was truly pathetic, actually experiencing a sense that each day felt like a year. To avoid Lucia, he could only work frantically, but nothing seemed to go smoothly. The Duke picked up his pen and started working. He just wanted to prove that he wouldn't be affected by anyone and certainly couldn't be swayed by a woman. But Lucia's image kept appearing in his mind. Just then there was a knock on the door. Secretary Yashin brought in a stack of documents and placed them on the Duke's desk. The Duke looked helplessly at the small mountain before him. Just as the secretary was about to quietly slip out, the Duke called him back. "When does that boy have a holiday?" The secretary knew that that boy the Duke referred to was young Master Damien. He told the Duke that Damien didn't have holidays, but he could apply for leave. The Duke said to let him come out then. Yashin smiled bitterly and reported to the Duke that it was very difficult to let Damien out as the school term had just started. Lucia raised her finger, explaining to the Duke, "If your son is to inherit the title, you must have a legal marriage. First, I have no family ties. Second, I'm the 16th princess of His Majesty. But the royal family has no presence at all, so the dowry won't be much." Lucia went on and on about her advantages. The Duke coldly replied, "Since when did you learn to talk back?" Feeling the Duke's gaze, Yashin nervously swallowed and said he would take care of it immediately. The Duke instructed him to prepare the household registration documents. Yashin thought the master must have already discussed with the madam about registering the young Duke in the household. But he couldn't help thinking that if the madam also had a child, there would inevitably be a succession battle. Damien, as the Duke's illegitimate son, was not allowed to be mentioned. At just 6 years old, he was sent to boarding school by the Duke. Just as he was about to open the door to leave, Elio knocked on the study door outside, saying he had something to report. Elio handed the letter in his hand to the Duke. After reading it, the Duke let out a fierce laugh. Then he notified Elio to mobilize troops. The Duke thought it had been a long time since he went hunting. The Duke showed a sinister smile, saying he hadn't been hunting for a long time. This terrified Secretary Yashin beside him. After all, what the Duke hunted were people. A few years ago, he had been on the battlefield with the Duke. Only then did he realize that the master didn't even blink when killing people. It was just like a devil. And what was even more frightening was that the master could hide his emotions and instantly turn into an elegant nobleman. Yashin asked the Duke if he would be gone for long, as the young master might return during this time. After pondering for a moment, the Duke directly ordered Yashin to bring Damien back. He instructed him to warn that boy to be respectful to his mother. He didn't want to hear any gossip when he returned. Yashin tremblingly guaranteed that such a situation would never occur. After Yashin left, the Duke leaned back in his chair and recalled. According to the news from the academy, although Damien wasn't as kind as his father, he didn't show any signs of cruelty either. The Duke, however, rolled his eyes, thinking this was too thoroughly prepared. Lucia also stated that she wouldn't interfere with the Duke's private life and that they could divorce at any time after marriage. He knew that even though Damien was only 8 years old, he was still of Turan blood, and the innocent Lucia was like a little rabbit in front of him. The Duke was a bit worried that Lucia might be mistreated when he wasn't around. He recalled that he had been controlled by the previous Duke because he had developed feelings for his brother's show. The Duke warned himself that such a thing should only happen once. He must harden his heart, strengthen his will, and not have any special attachments, so he sat down again and picked up his pan to start working. But in his mind, the scene of Lucia saying she didn't love him kept appearing. At this moment, the butler came in to ask how to arrange dinner for the Duke. The Duke told him not to prepare anything as he was leaving immediately. The butler suggested that it was already late and the Duke should depart tomorrow. The Duke directly refused and then asked the butler to inform the madam. The butler looked at the Duke with complex emotions, asking if the madam had committed some grave error. The Duke, however, straightened up at these words. On the other side, Lucia looked at Dr. Anna at the door in surprise. Dr. Anna, with tears streaming down her face, begged Lucia to accept the examination. She asked Lucia to save her. It turned out that the Duke would call her over every night to inquire about the treatment progress. Lucia remembered that the Duke had said it was up to her whether to undergo treatment or not, but now he was having Anna come over every day. Seeing Anna's desperate look, Lucia had no choice but to let her in. Hearing the madam's words, Anna thanked her profusely as if she had found a savior. Lucia was quite exasperated, thinking whether she should go to the office and slap him. To let him know she wasn't easy to bully either, Lucia decided to tell Dr. Anna everything. After understanding the situation, Anna dejectedly said that she didn't know how to treat it either. Then she promised Lucia that she would definitely try her best to find a solution. At this moment in the office, the butler was earnestly pleading for the madam. If the madam has done something wrong, please be magnanimous, your grace. You haven't spoken to the madam for several days now. She also mentioned her inability to bear children, assuring it wouldn't cause any trouble for the inheritance of the title. The Duke impatiently warned the butler that he was overstepping, but the butler walked up to the Duke and continued, urging him to cherish the madam. The madam came alone to the unfamiliar north. If even you avoid her, she'll truly be isolated and helpless. The Duke angrily rebuked him to shut up. He clenched his fists and warned the butler, suggesting he should speak for himself. The butler thought the master had misunderstood and hurriedly explained that this wasn't the madam's request. The next second, a cup flew past the butler and shattered on the ground. The Duke warned the butler again to shut up. Then he turned and left the study. After the Duke left, the butler fell to his knees. He was very remorseful, feeling he couldn't face the madam anymore. This had only made the misunderstanding worse. In this episode, the misunderstanding was finally resolved. The Duke not only explained a reason, but also sincerely apologized to Lucia. Lucia couldn't help but burst into tears, overwhelmed with emotion. The Duke covered his face, recalling what the butler had just said. If even you avoid the madam, she'll truly be isolated and helpless. Tom went back to the day they argued. When Lucia learned that the Duke refused to have children, the light in her eyes disappeared. No matter what the Duke said, she just agreed lifelessly. The Duke angrily pushed Lucia down on the sofa. He loudly questioned, "Do you know what I mean? Just answer me." But Lucia closed her eyes. The Duke looked at the docile Duchess before him like a puppet. This was the perfect wife he had always dreamed of. But he didn't know why he felt so miserable now. The Duke's pupils suddenly shook. He realized he had fallen in love with the woman before him. Unable to accept this, he suddenly stood up, fearing he would be swayed by Lucia. It turned out that without realizing it, Lucia had already captured his heart. However, the Duke was very confused about Lucia's motives. The Duke paced anxiously around the room, telling himself this absolutely couldn't happen. He turned around and once again demanded Lucia to accept treatment. Lucia said if she accepted treatment, she might get pregnant, but the Duke told her it was impossible to have children. Lucia continued to ask what if she did get pregnant. The Duke covered his face and blurted out, "Then the child definitely wouldn't be mine." After saying this, the Duke suddenly realized he had misspoken. He panicked and prepared to explain to Lucia. But Lucia had already been deeply hurt by then. Lucia directly interrupted the Duke. "Do you mean you won't acknowledge the child's identity? Or are you asserting that I'm unfaithful at this moment?" The Duke knew he needed to quickly comfort Lucia and explain and apologize to her, but the words caught in his throat and he couldn't say them. In the end, he just threw out a whatever and fled, leaving Lucia alone and heartbroken. Back to the present, the Duke recalled what the butler had just said. As the madam committed some grave error, the Duke suddenly realized that it was he who had made the mistake. Without realizing it, the Duke had walked to the garden. Just as he was about to go back, he saw Lucia's silhouette. The Duke hesitated for a moment. Then, as if making a decision, he clenched his fists and walked towards Lucia. He expressed his desire to have a serious talk with Lucia. Lucia also turned around and saw the Duke. Their eyes met. Seeing the Duke again, Lucia suddenly felt like crying. But the next second she smiled at the Duke was stunned. In that moment, he felt that everything except Lucia had lost its color, and the gloom and irritation that had been tormenting him instantly vanished. The Duke finally understood that what he truly feared wasn't being swayed by her. But losing this smile, Lucia told the Duke that the flowers in the garden were about to bloom. I heard you've been very busy lately. The Duke replied, I've finished what needed to be done, but there are other matters I need to go out and handle recently. The Duke suddenly noticed that Lucia's attendants weren't around her. Lucia happily told the Duke that she thought it would be nice to have some tea here now that the rain had stopped. It seemed more atmospheric. She then asked the Duke if he would like to join her for tea if he had no other business. Then the two of them went to the greenhouse together. The Duke gazed at Lucia with sorrowful eyes. Meanwhile, Lucia pretended to be happy, avoiding eye contact. The Duke involuntarily held Lucia's small hand. He asked Lucia what she had been doing lately. Lucia thought the Duke was acting strange and joked, we're talking as if we haven't seen each other in a long time. In reality, it's only been a few days. Hearing this, the Duke felt a storm raging in his heart. After all, these few short days had felt like an eternity to him. He thought about how he had been restless these past few days, while Lucia seemed unperturbed. It made him feel awful, yet he didn't want Lucia to suffer as he had. The Duke first pointed out that the Turin family wasn't poor, so it was impossible that they couldn't afford to take care of the wife's family. There was also no need to save on the dowry. Secondly, it was the tradition of the Turan family to absolutely forbid divorce. The Duke gently caressed Lucia's cheek. He never imagined that someone as delicate as Lucia could cause him such distress. The Duke looked at Lucia and then sincerely apologized for his careless words. He told Lucia, I've never seen you as an unfaithful woman. It's just that the Turan family bloodline is rare and it's extremely difficult to conceive. You're unlikely to have children. I didn't want you to have expectations and then be disappointed. As a result, I accidentally misspoke. I'm sorry for hurting you with those awful words. The Duke once again held Lucia's hand tightly. Lucia wanted to tell the Duke it was all right, but tears started rolling down her cheeks uncontrollably. Lucia covered her mouth. She didn't know what was happening to her. She meant to smile, but the tears kept flowing more and more. Lucia frantically wiped the tears from her face. She couldn't hold back anymore and began to sob loudly, covering her face. The Duke became even more flustered. He knelt before Lucia and apologized again. I'm sorry, it's my fault. Seeing Lucia cry uncontrollably, the Duke panicked. He hurriedly came before Lucia and sincerely apologized again. I'm sorry, it's my fault. Until just now, Lucia had felt as if she were in hell. She had even thought about slapping the Duke when she saw him. But the moment she actually saw the Duke, all the accumulated dissatisfaction seemed to dissolve like rock and water. She remembered a similar situation had occurred before. It was when she first saw the Duke in the sea of people. Only the Duke caught her eye. It was as if there were the only two people in the world. Lucia clearly knew she loved the Duke. Tom went back to when they had just met earlier. At that time, Lucia was still very afraid. If the Duke knew her true feelings, he might distance himself from her. So she told herself to hide this love, to never let him discover it, to act as if nothing had changed, to smile as usual. Lucia covered her lips, looking at the somewhat bewildered man before her. She had already forgiven him, but she still couldn't help wanting to. It wasn't because the Duke had hurt her so deeply. It was because of the Duke's gentle tone now, the hand caressing her cheek. It all made her very happy. Lucia thought, although no one knew her identity as a princess, it was quite nice to be able to freely enter and leave the palace disguised as a maid. She walked on the bustling street. Regarding private life, the Duke suddenly angrily questioned Lucia. In your eyes, am I the kind of dissolute nobleman who would still flirt around and have affairs after getting married? Lucia was thunderstruck, her heart shattering. Wasn't he covering her lips? Lucia was somewhat in disbelief. Can you guarantee to be faithful to your wife and never fall in love with another woman in this lifetime? Lucia hugged the Duke tightly. She wanted to return to how they were a few months ago. Lucia took a deep breath, her eyes brimming with tears. She found that after clarifying her feelings, her heart felt much more at ease. Lucia Stola glanced at the Duke. Now she finally understood the Duke must like her. She thought that no matter how flirtatious the Duke had been before, she was now his lawful wife. She decided to love him with all her might on an equal footing. Even if it took a lifetime, it didn't matter. Thinking of this, Lucia suddenly pushed the Duke away. Then with tears in her eyes, she asked the Duke if he understood. The Duke hurriedly nodded obediently. The next second Lucia said, I forgive you, but there are two conditions. The Duke felt a bit uneasy. There are conditions. He asked Lucia what they were. Lucia, with tears still on her face, told the Duke, first, you must give me a reconciliation kiss. The Duke was surprised. He didn't expect this kind of condition. He was certainly willing to accept. The next second, they embraced and kissed. For the second condition, Lucia said she wanted to change the contract. The original contract stated that she couldn't interfere with the Duke's private life. Now Lucia demanded that the Duke couldn't have other lovers. The Duke felt quite helpless. He hadn't even looked at other women since getting married. but in Lucia's eyes, he seemed to be an unworthy person. And he couldn't refute it. The Duke took Lucia's hand and gently kissed the back of it. He softly replied, "Whatever you say." After making the agreement, Lucia finally smiled. At this moment, a subordinate came to inform the Duke it was time to depart. The Duke looked at Lucia. Although he now understood his feelings for her, there were still many secrets. He needed time to decide how much to reveal to Lucia. This trip would give him time to think. Secretary Yashin was ordered to pick up young Master Damien from school today. After introducing himself, they quickly got into the carriage for the return journey. Seeing the Duke fall silent, Lucia retorted, Can you? At this moment, the Duke suddenly glared at Lucia. "Whether I can guarantee or not, it's none of your business." However, Lucia didn't back down. "Can I just ask?" The two stared at each other, sparks flying. In the bumpy carriage, Yashin looked at the cold young master and thought, if he had to endure this awkward atmosphere all the way to ruin, it would be unbearable. So Yashin deliberately coughed twice, then he smiled and asked the young master how he was doing at school. Damien just glanced at him, then coldly turned his head back to the window. If she was at a loss for words, indeed, blood ties couldn't be faked. The young master's appearance and aura were like they were carved from the same mold as the Duke. No paternity test was needed, just as he was marveling at how mature the young master was for his age. Damien suddenly turned his head and sharply questioned, "You don't seem to have the rank to pick me up, do you?" Yashin was stunned. He hadn't expected that the 8-year-old young master Damien not only remembered him but even recalled his position so clearly. He couldn't help but marvel at how extraordinary the Taran family bloodline was. Yashin nervously swallowed and explained that he was following the Duke's orders to pick him up as the Duke's household had recently welcomed a new mistress. Hearing this, Damien remembered that although he had been boarding at school for a long time, he had always been diligently receiving family news according to the Duke's wishes. He had naturally heard about this matter. Yashin thought that since the young master and the mistress were now in a mother-son relationship, the Duke probably wanted them to get to know each other. When Damien heard the phrase mother-son relationship, he realized he might have overestimated this secretary. Because in his eyes, the Duke was not a considerate person, Damien was puzzled. Doesn't the Duke have any other instructions? At this point, Yashin's eyes wandered, and he stammered that the Duke hoped the young master would show proper etiquette to his mother and be respectful. However, Damien saw this as the Duke's warning for him to behave. He understood that as an illegitimate child, if he wanted to reveal his identity publicly, he would inevitably need the Duchess's assistance. Thinking of this, Damien suddenly asked, "Is she beautiful?" Yashin was puzzled why the young master suddenly asked this question. After calming down, Lucia was very dejected. But he still replied honestly that he hadn't seen her many times, so he wasn't sure. Damien thought that whether someone was good-looking or not could be determined at a glance. It seems she probably wasn't very attractive. Then he continued looking out of the carriage. He believed that his new mother wouldn't welcome him at all. So he planned to stay in his room and not come out. He was prepared to endure any torment. After all, it wouldn't last more than a week. He could bear it. In the blink of an eye, the Duke had been gone for several days. Lucia wondered when the Duke would return. The butler helplessly told her it would take at least about a month. Lucia only knew that the Duke had gone to handle affairs in his territory. Previously, she had deliberately not paid attention to these matters, but now she wanted to know more about the Duke's affairs. The butler didn't know that they had reconciled. Fearing that the mistress might misunderstand, he explained that this trip was just an annual routine matter. Lucia took a sip of tea as she listened to the butler's description. Suddenly, she covered her mouth and gasped, startling the butler. Lucia remembered that she had forgotten it was the Duke's birthday today. She had been so busy being angry with the Duke lately that she had forgotten about it. Lucia, with tears in her eyes, scolded the butler for not reminding her. Otherwise, she could have celebrated his birthday before he left. The butler somewhat dejectedly told Lucia that the Duke had never specifically celebrated his birthday and was unwilling to mention his childhood experiences. Lucia suddenly felt sad. Did the Duke not have any childhood memories worth cherishing? Even though her own childhood wasn't good, she had happy times with her mother before entering the palace. This was all she had to offer. She didn't know what conditions could move the Duke. At this moment, Lucia recalled the Duke's words about refusing to save his lover. Lucia recalled the West Tower tragedy the butler had mentioned before. She felt that behind this incident there must be an unspeakable truth. Why could his brothers only make such a choice? Given that the Taran family's bloodline was thin, logically, the Duke should want more descendants. Then it made even less sense for him to resist her pregnancy, but Lucia remembered the Duke mentioning that he didn't need to leave his bloodline. She could sense the deep-rooted disgust in the Duke's tone. Lucia was curious. Could it be that Damien was a child born secretly by some woman against his wishes? But Lucia also felt that the Duke was too indifferent towards Damien, as if he wasn't his own son. Lucia was shocked by her own absurd thoughts and quickly interrupted her speculation. In the evening, the maid prepared medicine for Lucia to drink. Lucia had also heard that Anna had been constantly searching for treatment methods lately. It seems she had changed the prescription again. Lucia picked up the medicinal soup. She took just a small sip and found it was too bitter. But for Anna's sake, she had to force herself to drink it. However, after drinking it, she realized that the taste of these herbs was surprisingly similar to the medicine Philip gave her in her dream. The next day, Lucia looked at the sunny weather and sighed that she should go horseback riding. At this moment, the maid hurriedly ran over to tell Lucia that young Master Damien had returned. Lucia suddenly learned that young Master Damien was back, so she rushed to the entrance. Upon seeing Damien, Lucia was stunned because she discovered that Damien was simply a miniature version of the Duke. She had previously doubted that Damien was the Duke's biological son. Now it seemed impossible that he wasn't. Damien looked at the dumbfounded Lucia. She had a sudden inspiration and told the Duke that she had one more condition. She would absolutely never fall in love with him. The Duke was shocked upon hearing this. He thought Lucia must be at a loss for words now. Newly married only to find out her husband had an illegitimate child. He even imagined Lucia's next actions: A, glaring angrily due to the shock; B, storming off in anger; C, looking down on him with disdain; or D, without thinking, directly slapping him. But in reality, Lucia only politely said hello. This greatly surprised him. In his view, compared to those who wear their emotions on their faces, the Duchess's impassive expression made her seem like a high-level opponent difficult to deal with. He recalled his previous conversation with Yashin. Now it seems she was indeed very beautiful. The butler standing nearby reminded Lucia at this time that the young master had a tiring journey and needed rest. Then he asked Damien if he had eaten lunch. Damien replied that he didn't have much appetite, but Lucia firmly stated that this was a period of growth and he shouldn't be like this. She instructed the butler to prepare some easily digestible food for the young master. After Damien politely bowed to Lucia, he followed the servant into the palace. Watching Damien's retreating figure, Lucia let out a sigh. She thought Damien was simply too adorable. Seeing him was like seeing what the Duke must have looked like as a child. Then she curiously asked the butler if Damien was really only 8 years old. The butler didn't know how to explain, so he just answered that perhaps the young master was naturally tall. Lucia thought about it and agreed. After all, the Duke's son couldn't be short. The butler suddenly became a bit worried that Damien's appearance might be hard for the mistress to accept at first. Lucia's eyes gleamed with expectation as she asked the Duke, "How's this condition?" "I absolutely won't fall in love with you." This woman, in order to marry the Duke, proposed that she didn't care if the Duke had other lovers outside or even if the Duke would divorce her. But the next second, Lucia burst into pink heart bubbles, saying that Damien was too cute and seemed so well-behaved. The usually calm butler was shocked for 1,000 years. He didn't know how Lucia saw that young Master Damien was cute. He was clearly as cold and distant as the Duke. He even doubted if the mistress' eyesight was working properly. But by this time, Lucia was already looking forward to having dinner with Damien. Watching Lucia leave while humming a tune, the butler thought either the mistress had gone mad or he had. The butler couldn't understand why Lucia was so happy about this sudden appearance of an illegitimate child. Or was she too shocked to react? Thinking of this, the butler wiped his tears, feeling that the mistress was simply too pitiful. In the evening, waking from his sleep, Damien smelled a fragrance of flowers. So he went to the terrace, seeing the blooming flowers in the courtyard. He decided to go to the garden to appreciate them properly. Just as Damien was immersed in the flower fragrance, a voice came. Damien turned his head to see the smiling Lucia. He was puzzled why the Duchess seemed so happy to see him. Lucia then gently asked if he was hungry. This made Damien realize that not only was the Duchess beautiful, but even her voice was very friendly. He increasingly felt that the Duchess was a formidable opponent. They were not on the same wavelength at all. Lucia thought she might have disturbed him. Damien hurriedly denied this, and somewhat shyly explained that he had never spoken with young women before, had no memories of his birth mother, and the academy was all male, so he felt a bit awkward. The usually cold Damien even unexpectedly commented that the garden was very beautiful. Hearing this, Lucia became even happier. She then invited Damien to take a walk with her. Damien looked so much like the Duke that Lucia couldn't help but steal glances at him. She found that looking at Damien could slightly ease her longing for the Duke. At this moment, Damien suddenly turned his head and stared back at Lucia. Caught in the act, Lucia felt a bit embarrassed. She quickly changed the subject, asking Damien if he was on vacation now. Damien replied that he didn't have vacations but could apply for leave. Lucia was even more surprised. She felt that Damien's solemn tone of voice was very similar to the Duke's. Damien continued to explain, "It was the Duke who ordered me to return. He also told me to pay my respects to the Duchess." Damien actually addressed her as Duchess? Was he trying to distance himself from her starting with the form of address? Lucia thought for a moment. The most outrageous thing was that she even sincerely promised that she would never fall in love with the Duke. Hearing this, the Duke's pupils dilated. If he had directly called her mother, she probably would have been startled. Thinking of this, Lucia told Damien seriously, "To be honest, it's also difficult for me to suddenly consider you as my." Hearing this, Damien became a bit flustered. He hadn't expected the Duchess to take this approach at all. Lucia continued, "I guess it's hard for you to see me as a mother, right?" Damien thought he must have done something wrong to make Lucia say such things. However, Lucia explained, "I'm not blaming you. It's just that we've only just met. We're strangers to each other, so naturally there's a sense of distance." Damien frowned. He didn't know what the Duchess's purpose was in saying these things to him. Lucia was surprised to find that Damien had entered a defensive state like a bristling little black panther. Lucia covered her irrepressible smile. She found this Damien incredibly cute. She wanted to pinch his cheeks and ruffle his hair, but she was worried that doing so would make Damien even more guarded. So Lucia tactically coughed twice to calm herself down. Lucia remembered that she was only 10 years older than Damien. She pondered for a moment, then said seriously, "If that's the case, it would mean I had a child at 10 years old. Then your father should be considered a criminal." Hearing this, Damien almost burst out laughing. Then Lucia told Damien not to be so formal and not to call her Duchess so coldly. She extended her hand to Damien, telling him to just call her Lucia. Damien didn't understand why Lucia was doing this. To him, he was someone who shouldn't exist, and if the Duchess had her own children, he would be a stumbling block. As the Duchess, she had no need to be on good terms with him. Lucia, seeing Damien's delayed reaction, thought he might be unwilling. Damien also didn't know what Lucia's intentions were. He could only extend his hand, deciding to take it one step at a time. After a moment of stunned silence, he burst into laughter. Lucia was very confused. What's so funny about this? Lucia noticed that Damien was in a state of maximum defense towards her. She knew that even if she told Damien now that she wasn't an enemy, he probably wouldn't believe her. After all, as an illegitimate child without a mother, the first thing he must have learned was to be wary of others. But it didn't matter. Lucia believed that time would reveal the truths. Damien would have lunch and dinner with Lucia every day. Before meals, he would thoughtfully pull out the chair for Lucia, and Lucia would thank him. Damien stole a glance at Lucia sitting across from him. He found it amazing, although the time they spent together each day wasn't long. Just meals and after-dinner walks. Somehow, he found himself looking forward to this time more and more, and because of the Duchess's undisguised kindness towards him, even the servants became more attentive when taking care of him. Damien believed this was all thanks to the Duchess. In the evening, Lucia learned from Katie's letter that Mrs. Michelle had sprained her ankle, so she gave a letter to the butler and instructed him to send Mrs. Michelle some good medicine and flowers. Lucia thought she should find time to visit her. She suddenly wondered what Damien was doing. She then asked the butler, who told her that the young master was studying all the time, except when dining and walking with the Duchess. The next day when Lucia saw Damien, she praised him for his studying and said he was such a good boy. Suddenly being praised, Damien blushed a little. Lucia found the blushing Damien adorable. Damien explained proudly that he studied hard just to avoid falling behind when he returned to school. At this moment, Lucia suddenly stopped walking and faced Damien. "Why don't you call him father? Did he tell you not to?" Damien was a bit surprised. Then he lowered his head dejectedly. He thought the Duke would dislike being called that. Lucia couldn't understand why Damien would think this way. She advised Damien to call him father, assuring him that he absolutely wouldn't dislike it. Lucia then remembered that Damien had never called her by name either. So she pouted and complained, "You don't call me by my name either." But in her heart, she thought, "Don't think I don't know you're deliberately omitting the title." Seeing that the Duke had calmed down but still hadn't given her an answer, Lucia disappointingly prepared to leave. At this moment, the Duke called out to her. Realizing his little trick had been discovered, Damien became flustered and quickly denied it. Lucia then leaned slightly forward, gently inviting Damien to call her by name. She added, "I call you Damien too, don't I?" After a moment's hesitation, Damien called out Lucia's name. Lucia's attending physician, Anna, accidentally ran into Philip. She heard that Philip was also the Duke's family doctor and was highly skilled. In order to cure the Duchess's illness, Anna visited her. However, she ultimately didn't tell Philip about the Duchess's infertility. She felt that as a woman of noble status, it wasn't appropriate for others to know about her condition. After returning, the butler summoned Anna. He learned that Anna had gone to see Dr. Philip. He warned Anna not to let Philip see the Duchess, nor to mention anything about her dam. This was the master's order. Although Anna understood Philip's medical skills, the butler's words left her feeling quite helpless. Meanwhile, Katie, who hadn't been seen for a long time, arrived. Katie enthusiastically linked arms with Lucia, telling her that her great-grandmother was much better and thanked Lucia for the medicine she sent. Hearing Katie's words, Lucia finally felt relieved. At first, Mrs. Michelle often came to teach Lucia, but later, after Lucia's tea parties were successfully held, Mrs. Michelle reduced her visits citing health reasons. Afterwards, they only occasionally communicated through Katie. At this moment, Katie ordered someone to bring a basket. She held the basket like a treasure and told Lucia that this was the gift she had promised to give her last time. Lucia was very curious about what Katie had prepared. She let Lucia open it herself. A fluffy little fox appeared before Lucia's eyes. Lucia was instantly melted by its cuteness, exclaiming how adorable the little fox was. Katie also smiled and said that it was her first time seeing such a beautiful little fox and that it might look even better when it grows up. A few weeks ago, Katie had promised Lucia to give her a fox for hunting. Lucia thought she was just saying it, but didn't expect Katie to actually remember it. Lucia was very touched and thanked Katie for giving her such a wonderful gift. The Duke suddenly appeared before her, grasped her chin, and leaned close to Lucia. It turned out the Duke just wanted to test if Lucia would resist intimate contact if they were to marry. But Katie replied, "I'm happy that you like it." At this moment, Lucia covered her mouth, suddenly remembering it was time to go horseback riding. Then she invited Katie to go together, but before that, she wanted to introduce someone to her. Lucia handed the little fox to the maid and then asked her to invite Damien over. Katie was confused about who Damien was. Lucia explained that Damien was the Duke's son and now also her son. Katie was instantly dumbfounded. Meanwhile, Anna was seriously studying medical texts. Since the butler had spoken to her, she never went to see Philip again. But she felt that Philip was knowledgeable and didn't want to miss any chance to cure the Duchess. So without realizing it, she found herself at Philip's doorstep. As she was still hesitating whether to go in or not, Philip suddenly opened the door, smiling brightly and inviting Anna in. They talked until evening when Anna thanked Philip and prepared to leave. At this moment, Anna suddenly stopped, turned back and asked, "Can I come to see you again next time?" Philip smiled and said, "Of course, anytime." Since then, Anna often went to see him. Dr. Philip would always share his knowledge generously. Lucia called Damien and introduced him to her best friend, Katie. At this time, Katie's expression was very nervous. She thought, "I'm not mentally prepared for this." Damien politely greeted Katie. Katie also stammered, saying it was an honor to meet the young master. People were cheering for Duke Taran's triumphant return. Taran was the most popular nobleman among the people. Seeing that Lucia didn't resist, the Duke then closed the door and left, saying he would arrange a carriage to send her back. Lucia's mind went blank due to the Duke's sudden departure. Only after he left did she react, her cheeks blushing coyly. Katie felt that even when she fell in the city before, she wasn't as unable to control her expression as now. However, Lucia really liked Damien's mature way of speaking. Then Lucia asked Damien if he could ride a horse. Damien said he had learned at the academy, so Lucia wanted to invite him to go horseback riding together. Hearing this, Katie looked horrified and incredulous. Damien wanted to decline Lucia's invitation using studying as an excuse. But Lucia persuaded Damien, saying it wasn't good to stay cooped up inside all the time and warned that he might not grow tall if he continued like this. Damien trembled at these words and had no choice but to nod and agree. At this time, Katie reminded them that the riding ground was only for women. Lucia tilted her head and said she knew, but she thought since Damien was only 8, he didn't count as a man. Damien was shocked by this unexpected statement of not being counted as a man. Katie couldn't help but laugh. She looked at Damien's somewhat shy expression and thought this was how someone his age should be. At the riding ground, whenever Lucia received greetings from the noble ladies, she would always introduce Damien to them. And these noble ladies would invariably wear expressions as if they had swallowed flies, even thinking Lucia was unreasonable. But Lucia didn't care. At first, Katie couldn't understand why Lucia was doing this and even suspected she might have ulterior motives. But after careful observation, Katie found that Lucia wasn't the kind of person who was two-faced or hypocritical. She even slowly accepted this under Lucia's influence. After the three of them finished horseback riding, they came to the restroom. Lucia couldn't understand why everyone looked at Damien so coldly when he was the heir personally announced by the Duke. Katie told Lucia that this might be due to accept a tradition, as there had never been a case of an adopted illegitimate child inheriting a title. Then she collapsed on the ground due to weak legs. She shyly covered her face, realizing she had overlooked this crucial part of marriage. Meanwhile, the Duke was drafting the contract marriage agreement. Although he thought such things were meaningless, he had to get married for that boy to inherit his title. Lucia was chatting idly with Katie in the restroom at the riding ground. At this moment, Countess Felia approached with 2 baskets of yellow roses, expressing her wish to give them to Lucia and Katie. She told Lucia that she recently had a new granddaughter, and in the northern custom, yellow flowers are given to people around to bless the healthy and beautiful growth of one's granddaughter. Lucia was surprised as she had never heard of this custom before. She happily congratulated the Countess. He felt that if Lucia had a child, he would become a stumbling block, and then her kindness would instantly turn into malice. Damien told himself not to believe what Lucia said. At this time, Lucia continued, "Before I got married, I already knew of your existence. And it was on the condition of accepting your existence that I made your father agree to marry me." Damien was suddenly ashamed and incredulous. He had never heard of this before. Lucia explained to him, "Although the Duke is not exactly a loving father, you shouldn't think he hates you. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made you his heir." He felt that just being recognized by adults was already satisfying enough. As for fatherly love, he had never expected it. Lucia encouraged Damien, "You will definitely become as strong as the Duke because you are his son." Damien shyly agreed, after Lucia returned with a basket of yellow roses. The butler was shocked as if struck by lightning on a clear day, frozen in place. These were the yellow roses that the Duke hated the most. After Lucia handed the flowers to the butler, she left with Damien, leaving the butler alone, crying and confused in the wind. He looked at the yellow roses in his hands, not knowing what to do. The scene changes. Lucia was having afternoon tea with Damien. Lucia suddenly mentioned again that there seemed to be no roses in the courtyard. So she turned to tell the butler that she wanted to turn the garden into a rose garden next spring. The butler immediately froze. Speaking of marriage, he thought of Lucia's sincere expression and her shy appearance after being kissed. Then he persuaded Lucia to reconsider, saying that the Duke didn't like it very much. Hearing this, Lucia turned to ask Damien if he had noticed before that there were no roses in the courtyard. Damien sat up straight and answered seriously. Lucia thought that if someone wasn't particularly interested in flowers, they generally wouldn't notice. The butler burst into tears, thinking that the Duke was exactly that kind of person. Lucia even doubted whether the Duke knew the types of flowers. Then she suddenly remembered that the Duke must know one type. Before she could say it, she was interrupted by the butler's deliberate cough. Lucia was successfully amused by the butler. She said that even if she planted roses, she would exclude that color to avoid worrying the butler. But the butler was very distressed. It wasn't about the color at all. The Duke had once ordered that roses were forbidden to appear within his sight. Late at night, the air was filled with the smell of blood. The butler, along with knights and servants, waited at the entrance to welcome someone. It turned out that the Duke, who had gone to suppress the barbarians at the border, had returned. After learning from the butler that the Duchess had already retired, the Duke nodded. Then he unconsciously came to the door of Lucia's bedroom. After a month, he didn't know how Lucia was doing now. Just as he was about to open the door, he suddenly paused. Looking at his blood-stained body, he clenched his fists. He found that the smell of blood, which he had never cared about before, had become so pungent. The Duke didn't want Lucia to see him like this. Then he went to the bathroom. He felt that the smell of blood on his body couldn't be washed away, no matter what. He remembered that Philip had once said that the special feature of the Terran bloodline was that it could pass on extraordinary physical abilities and comprehension to descendants. And the bloodline flowing in his body was stronger than anyone else's. After bathing, the Duke sat down at Lucia's bedside. He found that just looking at her smooth face stirred something deep within him. He carefully pulled back the covers and lay down beside Lucia, seeing Lucia's sound, sleeping face. The Duke couldn't help but smile foolishly. He felt that Lucia was actually quite cute. Moreover, the conditions she proposed didn't cause him any loss. However, before that, he must thoroughly investigate Lucia's identity. The Duke couldn't help but show an indulgent smile. He even gently placed a kiss on her cheek. Then he held Lucia tightly in his arms. The Duke discovered that embracing this soft body could actually calm the strength in his own body. But after a moment, he suddenly blushed, realizing that another part of him seemed unable to calm down. The Duke warned himself not to wake Lucia, who was sleeping so soundly. He had originally just planned to sleep while holding her. But then he thought that he had just returned after so long and Lucia was just sleeping soundly. Wasn't that a bit too much? Convinced by his own excuse, the Duke leaned close to Lucia's ear, intending to gently wake her. But he found Lucia had no reaction, so he wrapped his arms around Lucia's slender waist, gently shook her twice, and softly called Lucia's name. The Duke was at a loss for words. Even this couldn't wake her up, provoked in a battle. He had no intention of letting Lucia off so easily. So he directly pulled off the covers and started kissing Lucia's neck. Suddenly, Lucia was awakened by this strange sensation. The Duke appeared before her eyes. She reached out her hand in disbelief, caressing the Duke's cheek. She thought she was dreaming, but the Duke had really returned. The next second, Lucia tightly embraced the Duke, then she took the initiative to kiss him. The Duke held Lucia's back and Lucia wrapped her arms around the Duke's neck. They were both eager to feel each other's presence. What follows is a scene that some might not prefer, so we'll skip it. The scene changes. The two were being affectionate again. The Duke was kissing Lucia's name. It made Lucia feel very ticklish, so the Duke said it wasn't ticklish enough and he actively went for it. At this moment, Lucia suddenly slapped the Duke's hand away. Then she pushed him away, saying, "No, I have to get up early tomorrow." The Duke looked at Lucia in confusion. It turned out that Lucia was preparing for a garden party 3 days later. So he called the subordinate Fabian and asked him to investigate Lucia. A month later, Fabian handed the Duke a mere few pages of Lucia's background information. The Duke flipped through the material, somewhat puzzled why there was so little. Fabian was usually very reliable. As it was her first time opening the garden to outsiders, she had vowed to make this event perfect. The Duke suddenly realized that Lucia seemed to have been doing quite well during his absence. Although he didn't want Lucia to be crying all day, he still felt a bit displeased. At this moment, Lucia suddenly told the Duke that Damien had returned. Lucia hoped that father and son could get along well, so she suggested having lunch together. However, the Duke said he would only be available for dinner. Then he asked if Damien had been disrespectful to her. Hearing this, Lucia was stunned. She was exasperated to find that the Duke didn't understand his son at all. Damien was actually mature and steady, impeccable in his conduct. The Duke continued, "If that kid dares to disrespect you, just tell me. I'll teach him a lesson." However, to the Duke's surprise, Lucia told him that would never happen. She even said, "We got along very well while you were away." After saying this, Lucia fell asleep in the Duke's arms. The next day, Lucia woke up in the glaring sunlight. She moved her fingers and found her whole body was weak. But then she remembered that the Duke had really returned last night, and she couldn't help but hide under the covers, secretly smiling. She recalled how the Duke looked when he returned last night. Lucia felt as if she was walking on clouds, floating. How could she be so happy? She felt she could do anything well now. She even cheered herself on, determined to prepare well for the party. But before that, she first had to get through the awkward bathing time. The Duke had come straight to her room when he returned last night. The maids would surely gossip about her and the Duke again. The busy day quickly came to an end. Lucia looked forward to the healing dinner time after a whole day of busyness. This was to be the first dinner for the three of them as a family, but when the three sat at the dinner table, the atmosphere was dead silent. The information showed that the most reliable thing was her princess identity, but she would disguise herself as a maid and leave the palace on the same day every week. The Duke and Damien were completely awkward. However, Lucia, with her unique perspectives, thought that the father and son now looked like an adorable lion king and cub. The maids watching this atmosphere thought, "The Duchess is really amazing. If I were to eat in such an atmosphere, I'd probably choke." Lucia believed that the Duke didn't dislike Damien, and Damien had also said he respected his father, so she thought if she could mediate between them, it should be fine. So she told the Duke that she wanted to bring Damien to the party. The Duke coldly glanced at Damien. However, Damien, who had just learned about this, was already terrified and panicking. The Duke was a bit curious. Isn't this a ladies' party? In Lucia's eyes, Damien was only 8 years old and shouldn't be considered a man yet. As soon as she said this, the dining room fell silent. Then the Duke chuckled and agreed with Lucia's point of view. Damien, whose face was originally red with embarrassment, was instantly shocked. The Duke had actually said something vulgar at the dinner table. After failing to dissuade him, Lucia angrily stood up and stormed out, slamming the door. The innocent Damien was left with a face full of question marks. He didn't know which words had made Lucia angry. The Duke was amused by Lucia's angry demeanor. This laugh from the Duke shocked Damien for 1,000 years. He realized then that the Duke could actually laugh. This laughter was neither cold nor mocking, but a genuine laugh from the heart, and all of this was because of Lucia. At this moment, Lucia came back again, poking her head in from outside the door, asking Damien to go for a walk with her. Both the Duke and Damien were stunned for a moment. After coming to his senses, Damien secretly glanced at the Duke. Then he sheepishly ran to Lucia's side, leaving the Duke sitting alone in the empty dining room. The Duke thought for a moment. Lucia's day to leave the palace was tomorrow, so he asked Fabian to bring her over. The Duke wondered how casual he could be about whether to marry Lucia or not. The Duke was left with a face full of question marks, wondering what was going on. Lucia and Damien went for a walk in the courtyard. Damien stole a glance at Lucia, finding it amazing that she wasn't afraid of the Duke. Lucia was amused by Damien's words. She told Damien that no wife is afraid of her husband. She even asked him if he would want his future wife to be afraid of him when he gets married. Damien shook his head. Damien's reaction made Lucia smile with satisfaction, but Damien still couldn't understand. Lucia was a petite and gentle herbivore, while the Duke was a powerful and fierce carnivore. How could two people at such extremes get along so well? At this point, Lucia curiously asked Damien if he was afraid of his father. Damien indicated that he was a little, but when Lucia asked him why he was afraid of the Duke, he couldn't answer. Lucia closed her eyes and earnestly told Damien, "It's because you don't understand your father that you're afraid of him." Lucia asked Damien to repeat after her, saying the word father. This unfamiliar word made Damien very hesitant, but Lucia kept urging him. Finally, Damien, with a red face, called out the word father. Lucia smiled with satisfaction and instinctively wanted to reach out her hand to pat Damien's head, but before she could touch him, Damien rarely dodged. At this moment, Damien was like a startled little cat. Lucia then realized she had overstepped her bounds, so she apologized to Damien and explained that people usually pat children's heads when praising them. She added, "If you don't like it, I won't touch you." Damien hesitated for a moment with his head down. Then he awkwardly expressed that he didn't dislike it, he just had never had such close contact with anyone before. Lucia found Damien's reaction adorable. She tentatively asked, "Can I pat you now?" He decided to flip a coin to decide. If it landed heads up, he would decisively marry her, tails he wouldn't. But the moment he tossed the coin, he regretted it. He thought marrying Lucia wasn't such a big deal, so he put away the coin and sat waiting for Lucia's arrival. Damien shyly nodded. Lucia carefully reached out her hand and placed it on Damien's head. Her heart was racing, pounding nonstop. After patting for a while, Lucia was amused by Damien's obedient demeanor and couldn't help but grin. Damien, with his little face blushing, obediently let Lucia pat him. Lucia suddenly thought that since Damien had been staying at school all the time, he probably didn't have a tailcoat to wear to the party. She was a bit troubled, wondering what to do. At this moment, Damien behind her said, "Actually, it's okay if I don't attend." Before he could finish, Lucia directly rejected his request. Although Lucia didn't want Damien to do anything against his will, there was a custom in social circles. Children who would enter society in the future needed to be introduced to everyone in advance. This party had invited all the celebrities from the northern social circles. Lucia believed that if Damien was formally introduced on such an occasion, his status would certainly be different. Just then, the Duke arrived. Lucia wanted to bring Damien to attend the party. But she was troubled because Damien didn't seem to have a suitable tailcoat. At this point, the Duke came and told Lucia that they could prepare ready-made clothes for Damien. After all, this was just a garden party, and there was no need to be overly concerned about attire. Lucia thought they should prepare clothes for a 12-year-old for Damien, but the Duke was confused, saying Damien was only 8 years old. Lucia explained that although Damien was only 8, he was like a giant compared to his peers. She even teased the Duke, saying he might even be taller than you were at 8 years old. As soon as she finished speaking, Damien beside her began to tremble. He noticed a sharp gaze sweeping towards him. Lucia then asked the Duke why he hadn't gone to his office after dinner. Fabian found Lucia and brought her to the Duke. Fabian reported to the Duke, "The princess has been brought." Hearing this, the Duke felt as if he had been interfering with the two of them. At this moment, Lucia came to the Duke's side. She wanted to use this opportunity to have Damien formally greet the Duke. Lucia waved to Damien. Damien, with a red face, reluctantly came before the Duke. Then he bowed and greeted, "It's been a while since I've greeted you. Have you been well lately?" Lucia whispered from the side, prompting Damien to call in father. Damien lowered his head and remained silent for a moment. Then, with determination in his eyes, he raised his head and called the Duke father. At this moment, Damien's heart was very anxious. He had never uttered this word before. He was very afraid that the Duke would reject him. Hearing the word father, the Duke was a bit stunned. At this point, Lucia gently nudged the Duke with her arm. Then she flashed a bright smile as if silently pressuring him. The Duke had no choice but to turn and look at Damien, acknowledging his call of father. Upon receiving the Duke's response, Damien instantly lit up, revealing a satisfied smile. Lucia also looked pleased seeing this scene. Then Lucia cheerfully suggested going for a walk together. However, the Duke raised an eyebrow and glanced at Damien. Damien, with his carnivorous instinct, sensed a hint of danger. Although he didn't know why, he felt there might not be a place for him here. The Duke, however, can certainly ask if she had hesitated. When he learned that Lucia hadn't hesitated and had come alone, the Duke showed a sly smile. He thought Lucia was quite brave to dare to come alone. So he immediately bowed to Lucia to say goodbye, wishing them a pleasant evening. After saying this, he turned and scurried away. Watching Damien's retreating figure, the Duke suddenly felt that he might not be so useless after all. However, the Duke truly hadn't expected Lucia to get along so well with Damien. He had previously prepared to turn a blind eye as long as the two didn't cause too much trouble. But he found that Lucia seemed to exceed his expectations in various aspects. The Duke didn't understand why Lucia wanted to bring Damien to the garden party. Lucia explained to the Duke that since Damien was now the Duke's son, he was also her son, so she wanted to introduce Damien to everyone. The Duke was surprised that Lucia could say the word son so easily. Lucia paused, asking, "Do you want me to be indifferent to the child?" Then she sadly wondered, "Or do you think I have ulterior motives for approaching Damien?" The Duke hurriedly grabbed Lucia's shoulders, explaining that it wasn't like that. It was just that the scene of Lucia patting Damien's head reminded him of long ago, when Hugh also liked to pat his head. Even though he disliked it, he couldn't resist Hugh's silly smile. He would even actively let him pat his head. Thinking of this, the Duke tightly embraced Lucia. His face beamed with happiness, as if he had gained the whole world. He now finally understood how Hugh felt when he had that expression. He wanted to tell Hugh that he had also met such a woman, even though he was already married to her. After their walk, the Duke and Lucia went to the study. Fabian presented a dance report. Although it was mostly trivial gossip, the Duke discovered that in the capital, people were gossiping about him, giving Lucia a mine as a wedding gift.